evening, everyone, and welcome to our Wiltshire branch webinar. This session is on the topic of IT contract pitfalls. My name is Keith Phillip, and together with my colleague, Alana Labelle, we will be hosting this evening's event. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items so that you know how to participate. Note that this event is being recorded. If you do not wish to attend a recorded event, then please disconnect, but be reassured a recording will become available on the Wiltshire BCS.org website. As this is a webinar, your mic will remain muted and your webcam disconnected during the event. The event duration will be no longer than an hour. If you have questions, please submit these by using the Q&A function in your Zoom control panel and directing your question to Alana. We will collate these and address them to our panelists at the end of this evening's event. If a question that you wish to ask has already been submitted, you may use the upvote option to register your interest. Please do not use the chat option to submit your questions. I would now like to introduce our panelist today, Jeremy Holt. Jeremy has presented to us on several occasions on different aspects of IT and contractual law, and tonight has provided us with the most understated biography. Simply an experienced IT lawyer and the co-author of 3 books on the subject. One of his books is a BCS publication, A Practical Guide to IT Law. It is now in its 3rd edition and updated with a chapter on GDPR. It is available from the BCS, a large online retailer, remain nameless, and most importantly, from www.goodread.com. Please check that, it's true. Jeremy, a very warm welcome and over to you.
Thank you, Keith, and thank you for the privilege of addressing the branch. If I just mention a couple of things about myself, I'm a solicitor. I've worked in the field of IT law for 44 years. If you are offered a book like this about IT law, I want you to say, but I know that's the 1st edition of the book. I don't want that one. This book is by me and a number of others. So that's the first one. If you're offered this book, I want you to say, that's more recent than this one, but I know that it's not the most up-to-date edition. The one that you really want to get, which is published by British Computer Society Chartered Institute for IT Law, is this one, which is a practical guide to IT law. And that has 2 different chapters in there on GDPR. I got £1 for my contribution to this book. And for these 2 books, it was done in accordance with the quality and I got nothing at all. My background, for 11 years, I was the secretary of the law specialist group of the British Computer Society. And the reason why I'm so interested in IT law is that when I first came to London to start work, I shared a house in Balham with a number of people who worked in the IT industry, and they would talk about different things that they were working on. And I just found it absolutely fascinating. And I worked on a case at work that was to do with computers, and I found that fascinating. And there wasn't really much of a specialism in IT law at that point. And I think the word went out that there was some solicitor who was interested in this field. And then the work really started to roll in. Now, what I'd like to talk to you about tonight is IT contracts. And I'm very proud of the fact, I was thinking about this earlier today, that although I've worked in this field for 44 years, I have never had any of the contracts that I've ever been involved in be checked in court. And my view of lawyers is that they should keep clients out of court, not encourage them to go to court. Now, a lot of people think that the reason why you have contracts is so that you win in court. to be honest with you, if you need to go to court, you've almost certainly lost, even if you win, because you'll never recover the full costs, and there'll be a huge amount of management distraction when you go to court. So I think the first thing I'd remind you of, that the function of drawing up an IT contract is not just limited to being able to hit the other person over the head with the contract if something goes wrong. It's also to clarify what people are meant to be doing under that contract. I have sat in meetings and I've turned to two directors from our client company and said, I've tried to summarize what they've been told to me. So does that mean that we need to do X? And one of the directors has said yes, and one of the directors has said no. So they've then turned to each other to sort that out. And I've gone and made another cup of coffee or something like that. So one of the functions, do think about this, is it's a kind of cleansing process, clarifying process. What are we trying to do under this contract? And it's as well to remember that. Now, the next thing is, and I've seen this happen a lot of times, I wish I had 10 pence for every time someone has said to me, but I never signed a written contract. Now, under English law, and I'm going to be talking about English law tonight, there are only a relatively few number of contracts that have to be in writing. One of them is anything to do with the sale of land. That must be in writing. And also, if you sell a ship, that has to be in writing. Now, contracts to do with IT projects don't have to be in writing. There's no legal obligation to do that. And quite often contracts arise because no contract was signed, but draft contracts went backwards and forwards. And it's then the role of the court, if there is a court case about that, to try and work out what the terms were of the contract that went backwards and forwards. And if all fails, and there was never any kind of contracts, you fall back on something such as the Sale of Goods or the Sale of Supply of Services Act, which is the kind of legal safety net. It falls back to at that point. What I'm about to say isn't designed to replace legal advice. I'll give you the best advice that I can. But my aim in this talk is just to make you a bit more street savvy about dealing with IT contracts, and perhaps to give you a bit more confidence about dealing with this. I mean, perhaps this talk could have been renamed Street Fighting Techniques in Negotiating IT Contracts. And as a cynical lawyer, you know, how do you think I got this appearance? We live in an imperfect world. And the best that we can do is to make it marginally better. You know, in my view, the best is the enemy of the good. It's better to get some kind of contract ready rather than one that's had every comma and full stop checked in there. Now, there are going to be two sides to each, at least two sides to every IT contract. Sometimes there's going to be more than that. So you may be on the supplier's side, or you may be from the customer side, and I'll flit backwards and forwards between the two. So let's just go through a checklist of important points to consider. First point, if you are the supplier, is the customer good for the money? Because if the customer isn't good for the money, there is no point in entering into the contract. And I've always said to clients, if you don't trust the other side, don't even enter into the contract. It's just going to end in tears. I can remember acting for a Danish supplier once, and we had a meeting with the customer, and the customer's MD was just a bit too fly so far as I was concerned. So I Googled him during the meeting and discovered that the last time he'd visited the United States, he'd been taken off the plane in handcuffs by the IRS. So I brought that to the attention of our client, the supplier. And he significantly increased the deposit they had to pay at the beginning of that contract. Next question, any contract, or almost any contract, has a length of time. This is generally called the term that it lasts for. So the next question is, how long are we agreeing to do this for? It may not be a separate contract. It may be a support contract. It may be a backup contract. How long are we agreeing to do this for? We don't want to agree to do this forever, because there might be a change in management control, there might be a change in ownership, and we might want to pull out of this market, and we don't want to have people working in this field here. So in my view, it's a grave mistake for the supplier ever to agree to do something forever. You know, how quickly can we get out of it if there is a change in approach? In other words, termination for convenience. Suppliers' obligations, what are we agreeing to do? What are we agreeing to do? And following on from that, and I've seen this so often, can we actually do this? We know what we've agreed to do, but is it vaporware? Does it exist yet? And what, you know, if we're not capable of doing it now, how quickly can we be in a position where we are capable of doing that? I mean, the history of IT law is littered with suppliers who simply weren't able to do what they had promised to do. One of the things which I learned very quickly is it's all very well to look to see what the supplier has to do. One of the most important things is also to find out what the customer's got to do, which is one of the reasons why agile computing is so popular. And if the supplier needs the customer to do a number of things, for goodness sake, make sure that those obligations are set out in the contract, perhaps in a schedule or in a particular part of the main part of the contract. I mean, just non-cooperation by the customer. I mean, I thought, well, why would the customer ever do that? It just doesn't seem to make sense. They don't get a good supply there. But I've seen it so often. If the supplier needs the customer to do something, get that obligation in the contract with timescales for coming back, with escalation procedures, if the customer isn't doing that. It's one of the most common complaints by suppliers. And I can't believe that there aren't a number of people listening to what I'm saying at the moment where it doesn't strike quite a strong chord. Now, warranties. Warranties are statements about what it is that you're supplying. Next question, how long do you give those warranties for? If it relates to equipment, they're generally for a year. If it relates to software, generally, but not always, they're either 3 months or 90 days. And with something like software, it should work in accordance with its specification. Maybe that the specification was drawn up by the supplier, but it's perfectly reasonable to ask for a warranty that the software will work in accordance with its specification. What the supplier shouldn't do is to say that the software is fit for purpose. Reason for that is heaven knows what fit for purpose means. And it may be that the customer had a purpose that they never communicated to the supplier. So if you're the supplier, say that the software is in accordance with the specification. Don't say it's fit for purpose there. So I search in the find box that you have at the top. If you've got a Word version of the contract, I search for the word purpose to see whether the expression fit for purpose has appeared anywhere in the contract. I also check for the expression, this is a slightly arcane legal point, to see whether time is of the essence. If time is of the essence, if you're 1 second late with supplying something, in theory, the customer can terminate the contract. Now, that isn't what the customer generally wants. In my experience, it's probably better for the customer to get something late, but correct, rather than incorrect, but on time. And no supplier will ever accept liability for consequential loss. So if you're acting for the supplier, check that there's an exclusion of consequential loss. Just search for the word consequential there, because there is a brand of in-house lawyers who think it's terribly clever to take an ordinary contract, reverse the polarity of a number of the clauses so that there is an inclusion of consequential loss. I tried to train all my customers, all my clients, never to accept liability for consequential loss. You will need to deal with intellectual property rights. In my experience, most of the time, it is better to leave the intellectual property rights with the supplier, because then they will upgrade them. They will defend them from third-party infringements. There'll be an encouragement for them to improve them. Now, if you don't want them to license those intellectual property rights to one of your competitors for a year or a couple of years, fine, let's get that in the contract. You don't need to own, as a customer, you don't need to own the intellectual property rights to be able to prevent somebody else from using them. You can agree that the supplier won't supply any of your competitors for a year or two after they've signed the contract with you as the customer. We've talked about termination for convenience. You normally have termination of contracts for insolvency and also for breach. So look to see how the contract can be terminated. Nowadays, I generally get used as a troubleshooter. I suppose I'm the kind of Red Adair of the IT law industry. I generally get brought in where there's a big problem. And one of the first of these kind of projects I did many years ago, I hadn't dealt with the original contract. It had all gone wrong, and I was brought in to try and sort it out. The original contract had no cap on liability, and everything that could go wrong on this project did go wrong. And we were fighting on a losing wicket here. And the board of the supplier were turning to me and say, Jeremy, what can we go down for here? What seemed to be happening is that the lawyer acting for the customer would go and smoke a bit more pot, come up with an extra head of claim, and then just increase the claim that they were going up. So there was no cap on liability. Now, that was an immensely cathartic experience for me. And forever afterwards, if I was ever acting for the supplier, I always made sure that there was a cap on liability. So the water could rise, but it couldn't go above the actual ceiling of the cap on liability. Last but one point I'd raise, if you're a lawyer, you read documents from the back forward. And one of the reasons for that is that the governing law of the contract is generally the last clause of the contract, and you need to know whether it's subject to English law or not. English lawyers can only really advise on English law contracts. However, what I used to do is, if it was subject to the law, a foreign law, say Californian law, I would say to the client, look, I'm an English lawyer. I can only advise as if it was subject to English law. If you want me to, I will advise as if it was subject to English law, and I'll write you a letter about it, or we'll have a meeting about it. Having listened to what I've got to say, you can then make a decision about whether you want to instruct a Californian lawyer to check it after I've checked it. And that seemed to work quite happily. It was something I learned from somebody I worked with pretty early on. And most clients seem to like that. So look to see what the governing law is. Of course, if you're dealing north of the border, they will want it subject to Scots law. But the good news is that Scots law contract law in Scotland is not that dissimilar from contract law in England. So it's not a major issue. And I think the final point that I'd make is, let's say you're the customer and there is something that's important to you. If it's important to you, get it in writing and make sure it appears in the contract. Don't accept any blather from the supplier. Oh, no, we don't need to deal with that. And all the rest of it. No, that's not important enough. Of course, we would deal with that and all the rest of it. Now, my approach, if I was acting for the customer, was that I would put the ITT and the response to the ITT as schedules to the main contract. And I'd say that whichever was later out of the two would always supersede what was earlier there. Because then, if it ever does need to be looked at by a judge in a court, they've got all the major documents there to be able to read. I mean, obviously, the response to the ITT will continue, and then there'll be further amendments that the parties will agree to it, perhaps after the contract signed, and that's fine. If you can show in correspondence that they've agreed a separate change, the normal change control procedure, then that's good. But I can't emphasize too much. If a point is important to you as one of the parties, get it in the contract. That's the whole point of the contract. The contract should include all the points that are important. Now, just a very final thing. If you want to get the best out of your lawyer, try to be a good client. So if you're going for a meeting with the lawyer, take all the paperwork. What lawyers don't want to hear is the client saying, "Oh, I thought about bringing that, but I didn't think it would be relevant." You as the client don't know whether it's relevant or not. It may be very relevant so far as the lawyer is concerned. When I used to deal with IT projects, contracts, I used to insist on all the paperwork being given to me, and I would look at every single page. I can remember one halfway through, goodness knows how many ring binders, where I suddenly realized that my approach to dealing with a particular thing was wrong, because there was something in the ring binder that made it clear that that approach wasn't likely to work. So it's a bit like loading your own ammunition in the army. If the ammunition doesn't work properly, it's because you didn't load it properly. I used to impress the clients that I used to ask for all the ring binders to be given to me, and I'd turn the pages over there. So try to be a good client, give them all the paperwork. If you're going to be out of contact for a while, do tell the lawyer you're going to be out of contact for a while. Don't leave things until the last moment, and hold on to the important documents. Now, I don't know whether I mentioned, there is a very good book on this subject. Here it is. It's a recommended text in more than 45 different universities in this country. My two daughters very wisely attended universities that did not recommend this book, rat bags. But there we go. Perfectly happy to, if you have been, thank you for listening, and I'll do my best to try and answer any questions that you may put forward.
Okay, Jeremy, thank you very much. And that was an extremely interesting presentation. As a reminder to everyone, if you have questions relating to this evening's webinar, please type them using the Q&A option in the control panel. Please don't use the chat option, as your question may not be logged. Again, if you do see a question that's already been asked, then please use the upvote option to flag any interest in your topic. Now, Jeremy, before we go on to questions, I'm going to tell everybody else here, in 2021, I had the opportunity to work with a supplier who agreed to do a piece of work for us free of charge. And having listened to this and similar presentations before, I am truly grateful for the experience you passed on to us. Everything worked peacefully. The development took place. It's operating, and I'm grateful that the supplier is able to now charge us for the returns on the development. So thank you for your imparting your experience before.
Keith, I'm free at lunchtime on a number of days in the near future, Keith. Hint, 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 hint. I'm awfully hungry. Am I being paid for this talk? I don't think I am. Oh, yummy, yummy. My tummy is rumbling, Keith. My tummy is rumbling.
Okay, that will be arranged. Okay.
Right, okay.
Anyway, I have a more serious question to ask.
Well, that seems pretty serious to me, but go on.
Okay. In the office I work in, I've recently seen some of our IT contractors by other clients being, in effect, asked to bid for their next IT contract of employment. And I just want to know, is this an effect of the GDPR regulations coming in?
I mean, are these freelance contractors or are they employees?
These are freelance contractors.
Okay. Well, so they're not employees. There's no question of employment law. They're being asked to bid, and is the idea that the lowest bid will get the work?
This is not in our office. This is with other clients. So I can only assume it would be the lowest bid would win the work, because that seemed to be the only parameter that the contracts were being or the bids were being based on.
Yeah, I must say I'm drawing on my experience. One of the things which I've learned is giving the work to the cheapest bidder, the least expensive bidder, is often not a good idea. And the reason for that is that they may have misunderstood the project. Everybody else understood it, but one just thought it was going to be a lot easier than they thought. And, you know, there's a triangle. There's cost, there's quality, and there's delivery time.
Yeah.
And quality is the most important of all, because you want it right. You may have to relent a little bit on delivery time unless it's a mission critical project. So I wouldn't use anybody who I didn't think could do the work, however cheaply anybody offered to do it. And if I was looking at it, I would put a major weighting on the quality of the supplier, unless the cost was Thank you, Tom. Thank you for the comment. Yeah, no, don't get me on government contractors. I mean, I lecture at Shrivenham to the people doing government IT contracts, and they say that they wish that they had me helping them. So remember the triangle of quality, time of delivery, and cost. Don't just look at it from the cost point of view. Don't let those blooming bean counters, the accountants who don't know anything about anything, rule the roost. At the end of the day, it's very painful if the person really isn't up to it, or they go bust halfway through.
Okay, Alana, do we have any other questions coming in?
We do.
Okay.
Thank you for that talk, Jeremy.
That's okay.
We will start with a question from John, who asks, in the case of supplier Fujitsu, customer post office, user postmasters, where in your opinion does the blame lie and what went wrong based on what you know?
Okay, this is just to recap. These are the poor postmasters and postmistresses who were sued. Now let's get this right. These were private prosecutions by the post office. It was nothing to do with the Crown Prosecution Service. They weren't public prosecutions, they were private prosecutions. And Fujitsu supplied some software. And as always, the software was not perfect. Hardly any piece of software is ever perfect. I mean, I talked about the world being imperfect there. This is a subject very close to my heart, and I feel very, very strongly about it. So I'll spend a minute or so just talking about it. I think the whole thing absolutely stinks. And our local post office, the postmaster there, Mr. Patel, talked about this about 2 or 3 years ago and said that there was a big scandal that was going to break. And he is a very, very careful person. And when he used it, he couldn't get the figures to balance. If he couldn't get the figures to balance, then there was something wrong with the system, because he knew where every penny went. What I think is so sad is a number of those postmasters and postmistresses used their own money to plug the gap when it was small amounts of money. But after a while, it just went completely wrong. I mean, Fujitsu have got some answering to do, but at the end of the day, it wasn't them who brought the private prosecutions against the people running the post offices. It was the post office. And I feel so sad that some of those people who were prosecuted have died, and so have had all the opprobrium to do with it. So Fujitsu is partly guilty. What makes my blood boil even more is that the blooming post office legal department, the year before this scandal broke, was awarded a special merit for excellence by the Law Society. So that probably tells you a lot more about the Law Society than I could possibly tell you this evening. I mean, fish rot from the head. So the very senior people in the post office, in my view, must have known about this. And also, it just doesn't make sense, because if they were, 20 corrupt postmasters or postmistresses one year, and then 25 the next year, and then 19 the next year, and then suddenly 75 and 150 the next year, then something different is happening. And there were people within Fujitsu who tried to blow the whistle, and who was saying now that they pointed that out. But I mean, nothing was done about it. I think actually the lawyers in the post office have got a certain amount of answering to do as well. And I would be very surprised if a number of them aren't professionally reprimanded, because as a lawyer, it is beaten into you when you do the training that although you have to do the best that you can for the client, you also owe other obligations to the court and to life generally, to be honest and truthful and not to screw other people and all the rest of it. And even if the client wants you to do that, you can say, I'm sorry, I'm not allowed to do that because of my professional code of conduct. So Fujitsu mildly, they did produce some tough software. It wasn't perfect. But I think the senior people in the post office, and also their lawyers, because their lawyers should never have been party to such a miscarriage of justice. I mean, morally, I just wouldn't have touched that with a barge pole. I just would have changed jobs. And it's such a shame that nobody actually blew a whistle about it. Sorry, I probably talked for too long about that. And thanks for the question. It was a good question.
That's great. Thank you for the answer. We have a question from Mark, who says, you mentioned that signatures are rarely seen. Though time and time again, I have customers request signatures for dynamically generated contracts, ones which change based automatically on what the customer has requested. Why do you think it is so frequent?
Okay, good question. In the old days, going back to sort of Anglo-Saxon and Norman times, you'd always have written contracts, and you'd sign, and then you'd sign in front of witnesses, so that if the person who signed said, oh, well, I never signed that, you produce the two witnesses, a bit like a will. A will has to be witnessed by two signatures, so you can go and get them to find out whether the person did actually make that will. There, that was in the old days. Now, I can remember when email first came in, there was a big question, and it must have been the same when Telex came in and all that kind of stuff. Can you make a contract by Telex? Can you make a contract by email? Yes, you can. And so if I send Alana a contract and say, Alana, I'm happy to do this if you agree to pay me X in return, and Alana sends me an email back to say, yep, that's fine by me, we've got a contract. There's no signature there, but we've got a contract. I think it's the old thing, that change takes a while to go through. I've always been relatively relaxed about it. If people wanted what lawyers call wet signatures, we'll have wet signatures. If it keeps everyone happy, we'll have wet signatures. If people are happy to exchange the contracts, if you've got an agreed form of the contracts, say, look, can we, and I'm happy to provide this, please confirm that you're happy to enter into the contract, send me an email to say that. I've also been perfectly happy with that. I've never had a problem with an email exchange of contracts. So I think we're just in a process of transition. But my advice to anybody, don't get too hung up about it. Just relax and do it the way that the other person wants to do it. I mean, my story about signatures is that I'm quite a keen studier of history. I was going to say historian, but I'm not a historian. I'm kind of keen studier of history. And when Charles II came back to the throne, he was pretty forgiving towards all the Roundheads who'd been involved in the Civil War, except one group of people, and they were the people who had signed his father's death warrant. Now, if you were wise and you were Roundhead and you'd signed Charles I's death warrant, you disappeared out of the country pretty damn quickly, because if he caught you, if Charles II caught you, you were hung, drawn and quartered, and that was just for starters. Now, a lot of my clients used to deal with local authorities, and if a contract went wrong, the person who had signed the contract on behalf of the local authorities were often hung, drawn and quartered. So it was just a nightmare trying to get the local authority to sign the contract. But all is not lost, because if you've agreed a contract, you can then send an email just saying, look, I'm going to supply you this. If you don't want me to supply you, please let me know immediately. But once I start supplying you, I expect you to carry out your half of the contract as well. So there will often be situations, happens a lot in building as well, so where the formal contracts are not signed, but the contracts are obviously live because people are doing work and other people are paying them for doing the work. So I mean, I just chill, just do the best that you can. And if they really won't respond, just say, well, I'm starting on Monday. I'm starting on the basis that you're going to pay me. If there's any problem with this, please let me know. So you put the ball in the other court, and that looks fantastic in front of the judge.
That's great information. We do actually have a question that essentially has already been partly answered, but if you have any further examples, the question from Binu. Thanks, Joe, for the talk. Very useful as always. You said only certain types of contracts need to be in writing. How do we prove in the event of a dispute if it is not written? Can you give some examples? Which, I mean, we've already talked about to an extent, but any further ones?
Yes. No. Again, a good question. Thank you, Bina. I mean, it's not so much that they weren't. It was that there was no formal signature of it. I mean, once you've got a draft contract, it's what's called the battle of the forms. So, I mean, let's take the example of me being the supplier and Alana as the customer. So, I supply Alana with a contract. If Alana never responds to that, even if there's no signature, but I start doing the work and Alana starts paying me, then the draft contract which I sent to Alana is the contract, because the court will say, well, Alana never said I don't agree that contract. Okay, there was no signed contract, but Jeremy sent Alana a contract. Alana didn't squawk, therefore there must be the contract. Now let's say Alana said, thanks for the contract, Jeremy, but I don't agree clause 9. And I say, okay, Alana, but okay, so if we change clause 9 to X, would you be happy with that? And then Alana doesn't respond to that. The contract will be the original contract as changed by my amendment. So it's rare that there's no contract at all. It's trying to work out which version of the contract is going to apply. And it's like a tennis match. It keeps on going backwards and forwards over the net. And if a bit like an ordinary tennis match, if you are the last one to get it over the net, you're almost certainly going to win. And there's lots. A clever lawyer can do a lot to say, look, this is the 13th draft of the contract. Here it is. If you've got any queries about this, please let us know within the next 48 hours. Otherwise, we will assume that the terms of this contract are okay. So if you're ever offered anything that is wrong contractually, squawk, come back and say, what on earth are you talking about? I've never agreed to pay you for doing this or doing that, and all the rest of it. I hope that helps.
That's great, thank you. Always good to put it back in their side of the court and see what comes of that. Just as a reminder, you can still send in further questions. Thank you for your responses in chat. It's been very helpful to add to the discussion. I'm glad to see this seems to have been an informative topic for people. I will let everyone have a chance to put in any further questions. So just pop any in if you have any to ask.
Thanks to both Jeremy and Alana, and to everyone for some great questions. If you have any other questions that we were unable to address, as Alana said, please contact one of us directly. On behalf of the BCS Wiltshire branch, thank you for everyone for attending today's session. I'll take this opportunity to inform you that our next event, and this is provided our recovery from COVID continues, will be held in person at the BCS HQ in Newbridge Square in Swindon. And for those of us who are local, it's one of the old Allied Dunbar Tri-Centre in Swindon Centre. The topic is data culture eats strategy for breakfast, and will be led by a gentleman called David Berrell from Montivo, and that's a local managed IT support firm. So again, everybody have a great rest of the evening.
Can I just mention? Yeah, Keith, can I just mention, I've put some notes up. I think I sent you some notes earlier today.
Yes.
There's 50 pages of notes. If anyone's sort of, if their life is too interesting, it would be ideal for them to read. They're a little bit long in the tooth, but they cover a number of the points which I've been talking about this evening, and I hope other people find them helpful.
That'd be great. We have a final question, actually,
Okay.
from Nathan. You mentioned the limits of liability. Any
Yeah.
comments specific to GDPR, where, if I understand correctly, a client can be exposed to unlimited liability, but the supplier may have a limit?
No, there's no, yeah. GDPR, where do I start? What is the cap on the limit of contracts? Normally, my starting position is what is the total value of the contract? You basically add all the elements of the contract together and what's the total figure? I normally use that as a figure and then just round it to a round number at that point. However, I've had opposition to that, where some people have said, if it's a breach of intellectual property rights, should there be any cap on liability? Because if you're selling something that you don't own, I don't want any cap on liability there. You can't put a cap on liability for anything to do with personal injury or death. You're not allowed by law to cap that. So in certain circumstances, I would accept no cap on liability for a number of specific heads, for example, intellectual property, death, personal injury. GDPR, again, the limits are horrendous as to what it can be if it's really gross in those circumstances. And very reluctantly, I would normally accept no cap on liability in relation to GDPR. It would be with reluctance, but I could see what the logic is about that. And certainly I know that there are a number of customers that if the supplier wants a cap on GDPR liability, the customer will not sign the contracts. A diktat's gone out from head office. In reality, the good news is it is very rare for there to be huge liability in relation to GDPR unless somebody has been absolutely stupid. So it's all very well to get worked up about it. It doesn't come up very often. And if you're behaving sensibly in relation to data protection, none of this will ever be a problem. The trouble is a lot of big companies don't behave sensibly in relation to data protection, British Airways being a classic example. So I hope that's helpful. I don't like no caps on liability, but if there's a good argument, then I don't waste breath and I just accept it and turn around to the client and just say, make jolly sure that you don't get a claim under that. We live in an imperfect world. You know, we just have to sort of, you know, if you don't sign the contract, then you won't make any money. So get real and get realistic.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. That seems to be all from me. So I will hand over to Keith.
Okay.
Keith, we seem to have someone listening to us from Puerto Rico, which seems fairly impressive.
Udell, I've dropped Udell a note to say thanks very much for taking the time to attend.